afternoon, everyone. So the post-lunchtime talk, I'll try and engage you as much as possible. So as we said, my name is Lynn Scarff. I'm Director of Science Gallery Dublin. Some of you might be familiar with Science Gallery, some not. I'm just going to show you a very short video to give you a little bit of an idea of what we've done so far.
To work in the Science Gallery as a mediator, and it just sparked off the love of science again. It made me remember why I'd started, why I'd done it in the first place. Very often as a mediator you see people walk in and maybe they wouldn't be interested or they wouldn't understand, and they leave with this genuine feeling of inspiration. They really feel like what you've told them is important, and it's something that they'll remember for the rest of their lives, I think.
Visually beautiful, and there was just so much to learn.
It's all creative, really creative, and it's quite interactive, so yeah, it's really good. I've been enjoying it.
Oh, it's excellent. It really is, yeah. I've come to a lot of the exhibitions.
To be honest, the Science Gallery has kind of changed my life in a strange kind of way, because it really allowed me to engage with the general public. And we ran an experiment here, got loads of samples off the Irish population and examined their immune systems in great detail. That was a great thrill. I think nobody else in the world had been able to do that.
I really love being in the gallery. People are coming in and talking to them. They ask questions in ways that I haven't framed them myself, so it does help my research in a certain way. It helps my students because they get excited again when they see everybody else being excited about their work. I enjoy the interaction and kind of sharing, I suppose, my enjoyment and my enthusiasm. It's ended up being a really great experience.
You never know what's going to happen next at the Science Gallery. It's the creativity of the team that's just amazing.
We fund a lot of scientific research, which can be regarded as ivory tower stuff. The thing about a location like this is it connects that science with the man on the street. And with kids in your target audience, 15 to 25, who are learning about this stuff in an exciting way, and it gets the passion back into it.
The future of Science Gallery, I don't know what it is, and that's part of the excitement. I think one of the great things about Science Gallery is how unpredictable it is, and how every time succeed in surprising me with the way you do things. So I don't know what it is, and I'm happy that way.
So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight. So to date, we've done 33 exhibitions, and our exhibitions are on broad themes that we produce on the basis that they can be interrogated from people from also, for example, Surface Tension looked at the future of water, Hack the City looked at the future of our cities, Human Plus looked at where we are going as a human species, Blood, which is on at the moment, brought artists, surgeons, feminists, engineers together to explore blood and what that means. And we're unusual, I suppose, in the context of art organisations in terms of how we're funded. And I know part of today is talking about partnerships. The Science Gallery is only 14% funded by the government, and the remainder of our funding comes through partnerships that we have with a variety of science and technology companies in some cases. So you can see Google up there, and also then through people like the Wellcome Trust, and also through Science Foundation Ireland, and then we do also get Department of Arts Heritage and the Gaeltacht. So our funding model, in as much as our curatorial model, is very mixed from lots of different areas and lots of different disciplines, and that it gives us a huge amount of freedom in terms of how we interact in this space that we're talking about today. So Science Gallery is about, it is a place, it's about community, but it's also about creating compelling experiences, because it would be all well and good if we were doing this wonderful work but nobody was coming to see it. And Last year, our visitor numbers were 406,000 for the year, and our target audience is 15 to 25-year-olds. So as Jose mentioned at the beginning, we're not really interested in the science museum model. What we're really interested in is creating compelling experiences for a very astute audience who know what they want and know what they like, and creating repeat experiences. So none of our exhibitions last longer than 3 months. In the context of the conversation today, I thought this was an interesting aspect because we feel that we very much occupy this space, this transition that's been happening for a number of years now. But moving into this kind of 21st century cultural model where you're moving from large institutions to small, from slow-moving curatorial processes to fast turnarounds that are linking in with cutting-edge research and what's happening in digital and technology spaces, from being very stable to agile, apart from being interactive, so not pushing a button, but actually really participative, so that when people are coming to your space or they're coming to some of the other spaces that you hear about today, there's a real genuine engagement. They're either giving something to the interaction or they're leaving something behind. That, this idea of being very porous, connected to other areas, being a creative platform, being a meeting place where people come to share ideas. So I would say that one of the most important things in the Science Gallery is our cafe, because it's there where people from the university, from tech companies in the area where we're based in Dublin, and from the local arts community meet and share ideas. And sometimes that happens organically, and sometimes it happens through the events and programs that we put together. So, very quickly, the things that we feel make us unique, experimentation, this idea of a hacker spirit, do things, allow yourself to fail, do them again. This repeat audience, this kind of, as we call them, our committed nerd core that connect with us all the time. And an understanding that our brand is more than a logo, and that's the idea that everything that we do in Science Gallery, we know that it belongs there. We have a very clear idea of what we are. Our curatorial process, however, is very open, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. But in the context of today and a lot of the artistic community that are here, I just wanted to say briefly some of the ways that our art science and our art technology experiences and relationships have happened. And I suppose there's kind of 4 kind of ways that we sort of see it happening in the space. One is this kind of engaging experiences, you could say. It's the instrumentalization of art by science, so artists or scientists using art as a way to bring people in to hear more about their research. You saw a bit of that in the video. The counter to that then is the instrumentalization of science by art. Some works that we call canaries, so they're kind of precautionary art and design ideas. Based on this idea that it's as consumers that we make choices. So if you want people to think about a future technology, you have to make it into something that's beautiful, that they want. And their desire for it is a way of engaging them in the conversation of if that's a future that they want to explore. And then co-creation, which is really the honey spot, which is an equal exploratory partnership. And that's really where Science Gallery likes to play the most. And it's the most difficult area to play because it takes time and investment and thought. And, so you have a whole range of works. These are some of the things that we've shown in Science Gallery before. This was Kiss Plates, which was a work by Maria Phelan, where people came in, they left their kiss, the bacteria, the one on the right, the person licked the plate, which is why there's a lot less bacteria, because you've got antibodies in your saliva. But people could take these home, they could turn them into placemats. People went on dates to see the kiss plates. This is a work by Paul Venusa, a great artist. This is called Latent Figure Protocol, and it's using DNA plasmids, but it's using them to tell a story. In this case, he has used it previously to make out a copyright mark around a particular DNA plasmid that is copyrighted by one research centre. This is an experiment we ran, which was around the ability of bees to detect UV light, and it ran throughout the gallery. So it was an unknown ending. It was a collaborative piece between an artist and a zoologist, by Bo Lotto, a neuroscientist as well. This is that canaries piece that I spoke about, a piece by Ulionis Orbonus. It's called Euthanasia Roller Coaster, and it's a speculative piece that was developed around a roller coaster that would kill you. So delving into that idea of we're an aging population. How are we all going to handle that in the future? And so a lot of the kind of pieces that we bring into the shows are riffing off themes that are being explored by the scientific community as well at the same time. And this piece, Silent Barrage, is a beautiful piece by Guy Ben-Ari working with Steve Potter Labs in Georgia Tech. And this piece is really in that collaborative space where I talked about. It's an ongoing experiment of robotic poles that react to people's movement in the space, stimulating a Petri dish of neuronal cells in Georgia Tech. And it's actually an experiment around epilepsy, and the audience is interacting and is providing the kind of disruptive signal in the space. Many of you are probably familiar with this work, but we've worked with them a lot, Aaron Katz and Yunit Zur. This is worry dolls. So these are very simple cell growth structures based on the idea of the Guatemalan worry doll, that you whisper your worries for the future to this doll and that in some way assuages them. And this was around your worries around what's happening in terms of synthetic biology and in terms of biotech at the moment. So how do we put things together? So our shows, as I said, are big themes. We have a group of Leonardos, so these are 50 thought leaders from the areas of science, arts, the media, and entrepreneurs and business, and they feed in ideas. And we do 4 themes a year. Each theme, we run an open call. So we ask people to submit ideas. Artists submit their ideas. It gets curated. Sometimes you get about 200 submissions, and that gets curated down to a show of about 25 pieces. But in the context of innovation, what does that mean? So a lot of the work that we do is about people submitting their ideas, and it's about Science Gallery being this midpoint. So we never think of an exhibition as being a finished product. We think of it as being a platform where people, either the artist or the researcher or the combination of two or the partnership, gets to explore their work, but gets the public to come in and in some way interrogate that work or test it out. This is an example of a project that we did for Infectious, the previous slide I showed you. We did a game in the Science Gallery using RFID tags where people could run around the space and infect each other, or they were immune. That project then was taken to do an actual study in a hospital about how infections are passed among staff and patients in a hospital in Italy. And it turns out that nurses, well, it's not that surprising, carry the most because they're interacting with the most people. But this is only one example of the kind of innovations that roll out of some of the exhibitions that we do. This is an example of a work that we did, again, during Infectious, where we were looking at, and in this case, the innovation is within the research space, where they were looking at a particular gene, tracking it across an Irish population. There was a presumption of that particular gene and how it was placed across the population that turned out to be incorrect. That then led to a whole different direction on the research project, and now has been used further for research into malaria, which is where the gene is connected. This is an example of Risk Lab, where we worked with a young tech company called Shimmer, who are doing work around signaling emotional responses that people have. In Risk Lab, people were playing poker, and Shimmer got 9 weeks of data from the development. So they were a young art and design tech company starting up. So they got 9 weeks of data from visitors coming to Science Gallery. And this is some of the kind of things that we set up. So this is a community lab space that was around a show we did called Grow Your Own, looking at synthetic biology. And we let residencies happen in the space, week-long residencies. So we had La Palaise, a group from Paris, come over, and they had developed a way of extracting ink from soil. And they were testing that out with our visitors and getting visitors to participate in the workshop and getting feedback from that process. This action led to this, which is human cheese, which was another experiment that we ran in the residency, and went completely viral. I've never seen something on Fox News and Wired and DZine at the same time, but human cheese will do that, I suppose. So what works? Themes work, open processes, that it's porous, that we're bringing people from different areas, that we're a creative platform and that we genuinely are that, and that this idea of cultural incubator. Also, those things are tricky. Sometimes scientists think it's too fluffy. Sometimes artists think it's too sciencey. You know, we're free, which means we have a very kind of busy funding model that we're working on all the time. And, you know, face-to-face interactions and those conversations take time to happen. And this beautiful diagram is a very intricate way of explaining everything that we do. So, as I was saying to you, we see ourselves operating in this public engagement space, this midpoint. And that's where our exhibition occurs. But there's lots of outputs from that. Sometimes they're research papers, sometimes they're social projects, sometimes they're actual products, sometimes it's a touring show, sometimes it's the artist developing their work further or developing in a new format. And so what's been really interesting for us is watching, if you like, this trough bit of this process. And we don't see ourselves as responsible for that innovation piece. Actually, we see ourselves merely as facilitators of that. But what we strive to do is to really get that public engagement piece happening really strongly. And you can see the different players that come into play there. Some examples of this happening. This is a project for surface tension, the future of water, where an engineer teamed up with a local designer. They were producing this very simple looking apparatus which actually cleans arsenic using sunlight. As part of it, we worked with them in setting up a funded campaign, and they raised €23,000, and they then went to try the work out in the field. Protai 2, another project in surface tension which has gone on to develop further over the last 3 years. And this was one of our first projects, Playhouse. It brought together 4 people who developed this very simple project around lighting up a building. But those 4 people, about 2 weeks ago, got $2 million in seed funding for DROP, a project that they were working on a completely different idea and theme. And when they were accepting the funding, there was a small presentation at one of the companies that was funding them, and they credited Science Gallery as being one of the spaces that was really important in their development process because it brought them together and it allowed them to experiment. And it allowed them to experiment and get feedback and experiment again. And I think that that's perhaps where the discussion today can go further, is around that idea of what can we do as platforms to create these kind of conversations. Thank you.
The context, yeah, is this on? Our second speaker is Memo Akten. I don't think it would be exaggeration to say that he's one of the most important names operating in the global digital art scene today. He has a very important background actually also in the field of creative technology. He's done commercial projects both alone and in the context of his previous company, Marshmallow Laser Fist, but he also has the most important awards in this field, like the Prix Ars Electronica Golden Nika for his project Forms. I think Memo is one of the practitioners today better positioned to show us the trouble between the different modes of production and the different models under which people are operating today in this cultural space. So thanks a lot, Memo.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Jose, for that introduction. So yeah, my name is Memo Akten, and I'm an artist based in London, originally from Istanbul, Turkey. I'm going to talk today about my work, but I'm not going to talk about the work. I'm going to talk about the different models, the different production models that I've worked within. So I'll use the projects to really go through that. And then I'll kind of categorize the works by the production models. I want to start with an overview of all the different range of projects that I've done, and really talk about what I do in summary. And what I do is I design systems that abstract behavior. What I'm really interested in is I create tools, I write software, that's mainly what I do, that allows us new ways of looking at things and realize relationships and patterns and harmonies and tensions. and then find ways of conveying these to us, to people, and really reveal and amplify relationships that we otherwise might not have noticed. And a big part of this, especially maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, not so much now, but I was very, very interested in exploring new ways of interacting with these systems. I'm still interested in this, but it's not my sole research area right now. So I was very much interested in creating interactive systems and finding a way of creating systems which are analogous to instruments. That was what I was really interested in. It's not just creating something that's interactive, but creating something that's an extension of our body that we can use to create and express ourselves. So I worked with dancers, I worked with all kinds of different input devices and that kind of stuff. And it's a way of, like I said, exploring data. But data isn't necessarily data that you find in databases. Data is everything. Data is the behavior of an ocean. It's the sound of the atmosphere. It's everything is ultimately data if you manage to bring it down to that level. And the other area I was very interested in, and still am, is exploring new canvases. Not being limited to just a rectangular screen, which is, as a visual artist, that was what was kind of the norm, but thinking about how we can find or reappropriate or invent new mediums, new ways of expressing ourselves, of putting content into. And so often, when I do this kind of work, I find myself at a lot of events and conferences which talk about this relationship between, or not even just talk about, but question the relationship between art and technology, which is, of course, a topic which one could talk about for hours. There's countless examples, but I just want to, I'm not going to go too deep into that. I just want to talk about, or just bring up, when in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, when oil painting became more common, it brought along a whole new technique of blending colors and layering textures, and it changed the medium. Or in the 1800s, when the paint tube was invented, and artists no longer were limited to their studio with their pig bladder to make their paint. They could go out to the fields and literally see the world in a new light. In fact, it was Renoir who allegedly said that if it wasn't for paint tubes, there would be no Cézanne, no Monet, no Impressionism. And combine this with the chemically made dyes in the labs of those days, I think it's quite easy to see that technology has always been a very important part of art. It has always shaped art. Today, we don't consider paint tubes to be cutting-edge technology, but in the 1800s it was, and many purists didn't even accept that as art. So today, myself and many people working in this field, we see lasers, lights, projectors, software, the internet, social media as paint tubes. It's new ways of expressing ourselves. But it's also a bit more than that. It's also new ways of interacting with each other. It's bringing new paradigms to social interaction. So in that way, it's very much part of what it is to be human. And as an artist, you explore what it is to be human. So it's, again, very integrated. Personally, for me, I'm not inspired by technology. I should say that at the beginning. For me, it's not what motivates me, but it's my medium. If I am excited about technology, it's only because of what that technology might allow me to understand about myself or people or our surroundings. But it is simply the medium. So now I'm going to go through some of the different models that I've worked within. I'm going to start with the simplest one. This one I don't do so much anymore because of certain limitations, and this is a self-commissioned projects. I used to do a lot of this. It's basically, you don't wait for anyone to commission you, you just get on with the work, you just do it. All I would really need is the time to do a project, and I might invest a little bit of money just to buy a screen or a projector, or hire a little bit of help. So here's a couple of projects. The colorful one is a project called Body Paint I did in 2009. It was exhibited, so I finished the work first, and then I look for a place to exhibit it. And that one I exhibited in Newcastle at Tyneside Cinema. It was later part of the Decode exhibition at the V&A, and it toured the world with that. The one next to it, the blue one, that's a project I did called Simple Harmonic Motion, which Again, I just developed in my studio on a monitor, and here I was showing it at the Roundhouse in London with Ron Howard's curtain call. At the bottom, the two projects there, one called Waves and one called Equilibrium, which I both developed last year. I took 3 or 4 months off. Equilibrium, that's the one with the touchscreen, in fact, is still on in Moscow, I believe. Well, I developed the piece, and then I had relationships with Future Everything, which Jose was mentioning. And so they were co-curating an exhibition in Moscow at a gallery called Laboratoria, and I became part of that exhibition. So this is a model that I still do. The obvious limitation is I can only do projects that I can afford to do out of my own pocket, which limits the scale. But this model of working is the most fun, because obviously you just do what you want to do. And linked to this is another model, which is what I call commissioned offshoots. These are projects which, off the back of the self-commissioned projects, someone sees one of those projects and then comes to me saying, I really loved what you did there. I'd like you to do something similar for me. And this time they do have a budget and they do have a deadline and a context. So in that respect, these are not as open brief because there's certain constraints that I need to fit within, but it's still a really great model to work with because people have come to me having seen some work that I've done that they like, so I don't need to do any convincing. I don't need to tell anyone why I need to do this. I'll just be commissioned. So the project at the top there was commissioned by the Rambar Dance Company. It was visuals for a ballet. And at the bottom, that's a music video for Depeche Mode. So quite diverse projects. Related to this, on a slightly different scale, is what I call commercial consultancy. These are, again, people who have seen what I've done, and they come, but they don't come to me saying, we love what you did there, we'd like you to do something similar. They come with an idea, and they want me to realize this idea. This isn't something that I do anymore that often. I will do it if I really like the idea, and most importantly, if I will learn from this project. If there are problems, technical or creative problems, that need solving on this project that I want to solve for my own work. So it becomes what I refer to as artistic R&D. So there's 2 projects here. One was for the Science Museum in 2010, the Who Am I Gallery, and the other one is a project called Cascada, which I did with Nexus Productions. And both of these projects, they weren't my idea. They came to me for me to help them realize the project. But the research areas were very in line with what I was already researching in my own work, except here I had the opportunity to work on a scale that I wasn't really able to explore within my own options. And so in that respect, this is a nice symbiotic relationship if you can get the relationship working quite well. In 2011, the scale of my projects were getting quite bigger, and so I was doing a lot more collaborations, especially with 2 friends, Robin and Barney, who you can see up there as well. And we tried to formalize this relationship and set up a studio. And we set up this studio called March from the Laser Feast. We didn't have a very clear manifesto. What we did know is we wanted to create what we refer to as interesting work. We wanted to explore new ways of making things. We just wanted to artistically explore new mediums. And that was our really only thing that we wanted to do. We were open to working with anyone. It could be commercial entities, theatre, performance, dance, music. We've really disrupted all of them. But we also did a lot of work with ad agencies, which is something which was new to me. I'd done commercial work before, but it was always, it was not with ad agencies. So the world of ad agencies was new to me. And to be perfectly honest, I wasn't very happy with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few projects which were good, because I think that's what's important to understand what bits did work, what bits didn't work. First of all, the main problem is motivation. When I'm creating work, my motivation is to create the best piece of work possible. Whereas when you're working with an ad agency, somewhere along the line, someone's motivation is to sell a product. And even though there can be a lot of overlap, if it's not 100% aligned, your intentions, then it often breaks down. I'm going to talk about a few projects where it didn't break down and why it didn't break down. This was 2011, one of the first projects we did as MLF. It was a projection mapping project for Sony PlayStation. They were launching a Netflix-style video channel, and they came to us wanting a projection mapping on a PlayStation. And we had done a lot of projection mapping in those days. We were getting a bit tired of projection mapping, so we used this project as a vehicle to pitch something that we wanted to do, which is paint a whole room white, and just project the whole room, have a moving camera, track the camera so we could align the content, the 3D, the field of view to the camera so that the effect worked really well. We wanted to have real life props, kind of theatrics, and really blur the line between the virtual and the physical. We wanted to have these puppeteers in white morph suits to add a bit of humour. And really, most importantly, we wanted to use this as a medium in which to tell a story where we would place a person and have their PlayStation transform their living room. And we pitched this to the agency, which was Studio Output, and to Sony, and they loved the idea, and then they just let us get on with it. It was a tiny team, and that's what I think made it work. There wasn't a massive chain. We were dealing with one person at the agency and one person at Sony, and that was it. When we had a meeting in the room, no one else needed to approve anything. So when we said something, they would say yes, we would go and do it. And we were open. We went with a disclaimer saying we don't actually know how to do most of this. We don't know how much of it is possible. We obviously presented backup plans so that we didn't look like complete idiots. But we did say, like, we don't know what we're going to be able to deliver. But we'd worked with them before, and that was the key, because they trusted us. So that's really the theme. That's the team there. Another project I'm talking about very briefly, in 2012, McLaren had seen that previous project, and they wanted the same. They wanted a projection mapping job because they wanted a viral, and projection mapping videos were getting a lot of hits in those days. We didn't want to do projection mapping. We were quite fed up of it, and we pitched this idea, which is, it's more complicated than it looks. It's long exposure, light painting, stop motion animation with a screen on a motion control rig, etc. But again, we were interested in exploring how we can paint with light in 3D in space. This isn't CG. This is actually what the camera sees, but it's long exposure. So we pitched this idea, and there was no agency involved. I had the meeting with the marketing director of McLaren, and his actual words to me were, "You've got a lot of balls coming in here, where we specifically ask for a projection mapping brief, and you present this art film. I love it." And we did it, and from that day on, in our vocabulary, we now have to pull a McLaren. To pull a McLaren is when we get a brief and we don't like it, and we throw it away, and we come up with a brand new brief. And it hardly ever works, because it's only worked when the team at the client side is small. If you have a chain of command of 100 people with creative agencies and their supervisors, and then it has to go to the other agency and this, someone along that line is going to say, no, let's stick to this. So that's the biggest thing that I think I've learned, is you just try to get to the end point. But both of those projects I'm really proud of, but I wouldn't call them my babies, because they are constrained by the requirements of the brand or the client. It's not what I would have done had I had a completely open brief. This project is the only project which I can say truly is my baby, or our baby, as the team who did it. This was for Saatchi and Saatchi, the New Directors Showcase 2012. It's a joyous celebration of techno-spirituality. I'm not going to talk much about the project. It's basically a bunch of quad rotors, and this was 2012. We pitched this in 2011, before drones were kind of hot property. No one had done a performance with them, ever. And this is quad rotors with mirrors, LEDs, and we were interested in how can we use this as a medium to create volumetric floating light sculptures dancing to music. And most critically, how can we use this to create an empathy between the audience and what looks like post-apocalyptic machines of warfare, but try to create something that's alive and sensitive and fragile. And that's what we wanted to do. And when we pitched this, we were working directly with Saatchi and Saatchi. They loved the idea, the creatives there, Jonathan Santana and Xander Smith. They not only trusted us, but they inspired us. And that's when you know that a relationship is really working. When you're having conversations, and my job isn't to try and convince the creative director that this is a good idea, but on the contrary, the creative director is feeding me and getting me more excited. And this is really rare. It's only happened to me once, and that's on this project. Our producer, Juliette Larth, who's an absolute superstar, overnight she became world expert on quad-rotor show logistics. Again, this team, it was about trust. Everyone trusted each other. No one had to convince each other of what to do, but everyone just got on with what they were doing. Again, when we pitched this project, we said we had no idea what we can do. We started with, let's have 100 quad rotors. Obviously, we had no idea. But we basically got the sign-off before we had a concrete idea, because we'd worked with them before, and they said, we know you can deliver something. Here's the money. Go and do your R&D. Go and deliver. So the critical aspect of this project, why this is my baby and not, say, the others, is because every aspect of this piece of work is how it is, because we creatively decided that's how it should be. There isn't a single thing in there which is there because it benefits the product. Even though this is promoting Saatchi and Saatchi, in a way, because it's on their stage, there's nothing in here which was designed to promote them. In fact, this ending here, we thought as soon as we put this video out, all the ad execs in the world are going to come to us and say, could that logo at the end be our logo? Instead of a smiley face. And sure enough, we still get emails of people wanting that. So these were the positive stories that I have in the commercial world. And I want to end on a completely different type of project. I've also been doing on the side about once every year, one a year or one every 2 years, not as often as I'd like, arts-funded projects. So I'll talk about one, which is Forms, which I did in 2012. This is the one that Jose Luis mentioned that got the Golden Nika. It's a collaboration with a good friend, Quayola, who's based in London as well. It's commissioned by the National Media Museum, and it's part of the Cultural Olympiad. So it was funded by iMove from the Cultural Olympiad project. And this was the context. They were basically curating an exhibition which looked at the historic study or the history of artistic study of movements. And they had original zoopraxiscopes, zoetropes, Muybridge prints, Etienne Jules Marais, Tim Macmillan's original time slice rig. They had all of these amazing, amazing artifacts, some dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. And they wanted to commission 2 contemporary pieces that would fit within this trajectory of artistic study of movements. And it was an open call. Quayola and I, we've never worked together, but we were good friends. We decided, let's give it a shot, and we won the commission. And this was an absolutely amazing experience, again, because every conversation we were having with the curator or the commissioner, it wasn't about us trying to convince them we should do this. It was us telling them, we're thinking about doing this, and then them bringing their wealth of knowledge to the table, and they were pulling us forward instead of us trying to push the project forward. And a lot of the time in the commercial arena, especially working with ad agencies, it feels like we're trying to push the project forward, and it's such a relief to be pulled forward. So the project we pitched was Forms. I'll show some excerpts from it. It's a very abstract deconstruction and reconstruction of athletic movements and trying to understand the qualities and the nature of the movements. Instead of tracing the trajectories of the movements, which actually, if you study the history of artistic study of movement, Etienne Jules Marais, at the end of the 1800s, he had done stuff, I mean, if I had more time, I'd go into it, but just insane, amazing work. Work which, if you saw today, you would think it's contemporary, but he was doing it over 120 years ago and inventing devices to do this. You know, pioneering chronophotography, pioneering kind of photographic guns that could take multiple exposures. So we really didn't want to do a tracing of movement, but we wanted to imagine the effects of the movements might have on an imaginary environment, depending on the different types of the movements. And yeah, so this was at the National Media Museum in Bradford, and I don't think it's on right now, or maybe it is, but it's touring as well. And that's all I have to say for now. More in the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Memo. The title of this panel, had a word very much at the center, disruption, and the last speaker is going to explore the meanings and the implications of this word in the context page today. She's Tatiana Bazzichelli. She's been the curator of one of the most relevant and longest running new media festivals in the world, Transmediale, for the last 4 years. She's also the author of Network Disruption, a publication that has been the basis of her PhD. And her next upcoming project is the Disruption Network Lab program based in Berlin. Thank you, Tatiana.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me here, especially Ruth and Gabi. I'm really happy to be, especially in this track related to disruption, because I've been working with the topic of disruption since now more or less 6 years, and I started to analyze the concept, especially in the context of my PhD at Aarhus University, and I tried also to bring this concept into my activity as curator. And at the moment I am, as was introduced, in the process of starting a new curatorial program that is called Disruption Network Lab. And, but in this specific presentation, since we are also in the context of disrupting innovation or disruptive innovation, I would like more to focus on my previous research that is still ongoing, and also how it's possible to bring this research into a curatorial artistic context. So I will go then to the specific project I'm working at the moment. And so I think since we have been part of this panel, but we have not really defined the notion of disruption, I thought that perhaps was good to start like that. And especially if we speak about disruptive innovation, that is actually different from disrupting innovation. We could refer to the work of Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School that started really to work on this specific notion already in the 90s. And for example, he was defining disrupting innovation as in this way, like a process that disrupts the market in expected way to generate a product that the market does not expect. So if you generate a product that is creating an innovation, then you are also creating a disruption. And my specific point of view, since I'm not coming from a business school, but I'm merely mostly a sociologist, has been how to bring this concept of disruption into the art field and the technology reflection. And so this is actually the cover of my book. I wanted to show you, not really to do advertisement, but because I wanted to focus exactly on the title that is exactly related to rethinking opposition in the context of art activism and the business of social networking. So the starting point of my reflection has been, why do we need to rethink opposition? And so here I start going through, and this is a model that I created in 2011 that I call disruptive feedback loop, because the point of view was that if we try to imagine in a business perspective a process or a product that is introduced in a market in an expected way, then what happens if we introduce a practice, an artwork, or even a thought into the context of art able to disrupt the process from the inside. So in this specific model that I created, I'm generating a loop because from my perspective, it's possible to analyze artists, hackers, activists, entrepreneurs, and also networkers are people that from one side are creating disruption to generate art, but at the same time are also feeding a certain economy that could be a disruptive economy to generate business. And unfortunately, this has been true for much of the history of hacking, especially if we refer to the history of the development of a Silicon Valley. And going bits back in my personal experience, I started to analyze in this research different projects that were working with the discourse of disruption and as a form of unexpected intervention into closed system. And I will also show you some specific example to try to imagine actually if disruption could be also connected to the discourse of art development. So how disruption could be an art form. But by analyzing that, since there is the loop that I was mentioning before, I think we have always to analyze also what is the development of business, especially in terms of network economy and information technology, because these are actually machines that are feeding each other. And especially if we want to reflect about digital utopias, I think perhaps we should also question what utopias are, what digital is, and at the same time, if we are still in the process of imagining utopias and what they could be, since we could say that the business and the disruptive business has been part of the development of digital culture, network culture since many years. So my background comes from the hacker culture and the activist field of Italy. I'm Italian, and in the 90s I was part of a hacker collectives, and at the same time I also started to work with the discourse of curating as a network practice. And I always like to show this specific image that was made in 1992 from postal artist Vittore Baroni, because I think that's already in that time he understood pretty well a lot of creative networking process that happened later, not only himself, but also many postal artists and people part of mail art, even before of Fluxus. And in this specific image, we can see that networking as a practice comes from different artistic roots that are basically avant-garde projects, but not only, also punk, counterculture, hacking, and at the same time is informed by the combined use of media that, of course, in the 90s were not the same of today, like photocopies, phone, fax, computer, cassette, and so on. And this for us was actually an utopia, because we really understood that it was possible to create art and to create political practices by using media in a certain way and also by appropriating media. So the whole idea of do-it-yourself in that time really meant to get to create projects that were collaborative projects, they were contexts of participation, and most of all, they were a specific way of using media in a interlinked way in which you could basically create your own medium. And then in 2003, I moved to Berlin, and I still remember in 2004 when I went to visit one of the first conferences about Web 2.0, and there was Tim O'Reilly that was actually speaking about the whole concept of Web 2.0 in that specific time, and I was really surprised because he started really to use a lot of notions that for me in the years before were totally proper of artists, hackers, and activists. For example, the idea of openness, do-it-yourself, sharing. I never heard them before so much use in a business context like in that time. So I have to admit that the first reaction was kind of anger, because I say, oh, how is possible that you know, there are so many people that work in these fields using certain topics that were highly political, and there was totally no mention of these practices, but of course there was mention of hacking. And this also struck my attention, because coming from Italy, for me, hacking was a really political practice. And of course, I was getting more and more interested in how, especially in California and the Silicon Valley, this concept was instead applied to business development. So I went to California, and I went to know Fred Turner, that wrote a really interesting book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And he wrote, that is why there is an image, and a paper related to Burning Man at Google. And I found really interesting, because he was saying that actually Burning Man, I don't know if you know, is a festival happening every year in the desert, northern Nevada, where a lot of people meet in the desert and create basically do-it-yourself camps, and is a totally event based on sharing, while a lot of people share their goods, and at the same time there is no currency. Besides, you can only buy coffee and ice, but you cannot buy anything else, and people produce really wonderful art pieces, really huge, massive art constructions. And so Fred Turner in that specific paper says that this specific event that actually, according to other studies I did, is also coming from totally underground and avant-gardistic practice like the Suicide Club and the Cacophony Society, is totally really functional to the development of the ethos of the Silicon Valley, because basically the people go there to experience a moment of freedom, but they also are still, if you want, working, because it's the place in which many of these companies go. And so for me, this was a perfect example, also a perfect image, because it's pretty centralized. It so shows that the man that is usually born at the end of the festival is at the center of a camp, while instead speaking with people that came from the previous experience, they told me that the man was actually constructed and put up by many people that were together, rising up the man and then burning it when Burning Man was still in Baker Beach. And I think this image is perhaps a bit a symbol of a lot of change in terms of hacker culture and also sharing, that perhaps we are getting more and more into a centralization of these practices. And this is not a surprise, because as Fred Turner writes, business and counterculture has always been the face of the same medal, especially in California. But I would say that in Europe, maybe in Italy most of all, because I come from there, we always created a separation. And this was a bit our digital utopia. And I think this utopia doesn't exist anymore. So what could be the new utopias? I'm actually a bit critical with the word utopia today, because I think that's, is a context that implies something happening in the future that still didn't happen, that is actually great, but still could be really easily appropriated by people that want to fill up this concept. So my question would be, how could we imagine new artistic practices that are not just merely based on opposition, because we understood that the opposition basically doesn't work anymore, since there have never been this totally opposition. There has always been a feedback loop of practices feeding each other. The idea is, therefore, to work on disruption. And the concept of disruption for me means to try to imagine practices that are happening from the inside of the system. So they are not creating an opposition from the outside, but they are trying to transform the system from the inside, and in that sense create new form of artistic practices that are not only feeding the machine, but are maybe inventing new machinery that are not only related to appropriation of certain practices. And this specific project that I wanted to show is made by Telecomunisten Collective in collaboration with Raum Labor and Transmediale Festival. And also the male artist network is something that I curated in Transmediale 2013, and it was called Octo P7C1. It was a system of pneumatic tubes that were created at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, the place where Transmediale is happening, and was also a criticism of a centralized social network, because the idea was how actually a centralized social network works and how it's possible to, create a sort of miscommunication technology with that is also part of the series of the Telecommunisten. And so the idea was also, going back to the historical Rohpost in Berlin, like the pneumatic post connection, was really a perfect example in which we were analyzing how a centralized system can work with different peripheric stations and how the visitors were interacting by sending different capsules that were traveling. And all the systems were just developed with vacuum cleaners. So this is also showing you that it's possible to create a social network that is not necessarily digital. And another really good example for me that could reflect on the discourse of disruption is to imagine disruption as a viral and flexible strategy as actually does contemporary networking business. So basically, instead of looking for this enemy, because we don't know who is the enemy, the idea is to stop claiming to have the truth and try to create your own truths, and also trying to learn from business how to be totally pervasive. And I think the anonymous network is a perfect example of that, because it's playing with the discourse of disruption, but at the same time is based on total anonymity. So in that sense, disrupt the system from the inside, because you don't know who are these people, but is also creating constantly coexistence of opposition, in the sense it's not just a frontal opposition, but is the distributed opposition that's is based on dismantling the concept of truth by itself and also the concept of centralization. And in that sense, I think is a way to change our strategy and also exposing contradiction, disturbance, and generate confusion. And I think this is a specific way of creating disruption. If we go back to the definition, this a process that disrupts the market in an expected way. So in this sense, we could imagine what is the art of disrupting business. And another example that also goes to my present, the last event I organized, for example, at Transmediale, I was curating last year this conference track named Hashes to Ashes, and there was a panel with Trevor Paglen, Laura Poitras, and Jay Kappelbaum, named Art as Evidence. And I think this concept of art as evidence is pretty interesting to understand the form of disruption that is also not just oppositional, but is really trying to understand how the system works from the inside. And this is a work of Trevor Paglen that, of course, is difficult to see because this is the point. I mean, is about drones, and usually Trevor creates really great photographies using a system that allow you to make photos of, for example, hidden military bases or drones that are on the sky, and theoretically you don't see them, but you know that they are there, and you can only see if you put the resolution of the photo so high that you can see a cloud. And this concept is highly interesting because it's showing that nothing is neutral in our reality, and actually things are happening under our eyes, and often we don't see. But if you understand how the systems are working and actually in which way it's possible to unlock the secret, then it's still possible to create artistic projects that are also revealing the people that's, there is a form of evidence that is possible to discover. And in that sense, his works are really related with the discourse of art of evidence, and also we could say that is a way to expose the surveillance machinery as well by exploring its strength and while testing its limits. And I would just conclude now telling you the last things I'm doing. This is the new project that I'm launching in Berlin at the Kunstquartier Bethanien, so it's the Bethanien Art Quarter. It's a cycle of conferences that are related also with the concept of disruption as a feedback loop between art, technology, and digital culture, especially with a political approach in the use of technology. And the first events will be the 17th and 18th of April, and is actually based on the reflection on drone technology. So I hope you will come. And the others will go on more or less every 6 weeks until December by pointing out each event a different way to reflect on disruption by bringing together artists, hackers, whistleblowers, activists, and researchers. And at the moment, another project I'm doing, and with that I will conclude, is an exhibition called Network Disruption. So it's the exhibition of my book, Network Disruption. And for me, it was really interesting to try to imagine how this research could actually be brought into a physical space, because often when you write a PhD, you write a book, you imagine a lot of concept theoretically, even if you are based on practices, but then try to transform that into an exhibition is a totally different work. And so the technique I'm using, since in the exhibition there will be many collectives, because as I say, I'm also going historically back into projects that were using the idea of disruption to produce art, and also trying to create a sort of infiltration in systems. So for example, we have actually the early Burning Man, the Cacophony Society, the Suicide Club, and Anonymous, Luther Blissett, Neoism, mail art in the line of disruption, but also contemporary works from Julian Oliver, the Peng Collective, the Telekommunisten, Trevor Paglen, and also Laura Poitras, that is not listed, but is there. And this exhibition is also in collaboration with the End Festival. So it's produced by Axioma Project Space, will happen the 11th of March at the Skuch Gallery and in Ljubljana, and then we'll travel to Croatia at the Museum of Contemporary Art in April. And we are also discussing with the End Festival how to bring into this context this kind of work. And yeah, so with that I finish. And also, if you are interested in going more into this discussion, if you go into Disruptive of Bits, that is my website, you can download all my publications. So I usually have everything totally open to be downloaded. And yes, thank you very much.
So here's the discussion. We have about a little bit more than 15 minutes. I think together you have actually sort of defined different vectors of a territory. I started the presentation saying that there is not a model today, there are many models. And we are seeing how from different spaces we are operating to define this possible context of a disruption in innovation in the way that culture operates and arts operates within a space of other agents. I had a couple of questions before opening up for the floor. There was something, Lynn, in your presentation that I found interesting, which was that instead of actually not of being afraid of explaining how, in the context of Science Gallery, the relationship between scientists and artists, science and art can be, in a way, how would I say this? This notion of instrumentalization, it was something that you can even push up from, how art can instrumentalize science and science can instrumentalize art in a context where probably many artists could be afraid of the fact that they're here just to make a point that makes the work of scientists more understandable, and at the same time scientists are afraid that their work could be trivialized. So how do you actually operate in a context where both sides to really understand how in this space there's a mutually beneficial relationship, but also there are these possibilities where sometimes you are being used and you're in the possibility of using the resources and the tools and the discourse of the other?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. And I suppose I kind of put those up because I think in the context of the conversation today, many people maybe have experience of such, or that's sometimes the way that they think about it. In terms of Science Gallery, I suppose the way that we kind of have that conversation is really about the curatorial process that we enter into. And so because the way that we curate exhibitions is very open, and we're asking people to submit their work and to develop their work collaboratively, if that's the suggestion, in some ways we put that conversation up front. So in no way do we see ourselves as being referees of that kind of process, if you like. It's more an acknowledgement that these are some of the kind of relationships that are out there. This is some of the different ways that they operate. One isn't, in terms of probably the conversation around innovation, the kind of creative collaborative piece of process is probably the most innovative in terms of what comes out of it at the end, but the others exist, I guess. Yeah, it doesn't really answer your question, but yeah.
And Memo, we were discussing before actually how these experiences where artists are embedded in the context of commercial commissions, it's many cases a territory of continued frustration, or a relationship which is never defined necessarily because both sides feel they can be engaged in a productive collaboration, but by other set of factors. But you were also telling me your conviction that it actually didn't need to be like that, or that there was possible models where the reason that an artist would have to look for situating their work beyond the context of art and in the context of commercial or industry were not just to pay the bills, but maybe because that's a context to do a kind of work that wouldn't be received or reached any other way. I don't know exactly how do you imagine that this evolution would be possible, also because I think that the last years have sort of set a path of both promising or encouraging signs and also big disappointments.
Yeah. So I think it's the motivation which I've come to, and like if I have to simplify the problem down to one word, it's a problem of motivation, in that what is it that motivates me to do a project? What is it that motivates a curator of a gallery or an arts institution that wants to commission that project? And usually that's in line with what, the artist is usually in line with that. And that's why when you have conversations, the conversation is always very constructive. The conversation between the artist and the curator, the commissioner, is very constructive to the project. If you're, like, you wouldn't believe, so I've actually left Marshall Laserfeast now. They're still my best friends. But you wouldn't believe the number of emails that we would get on an almost daily basis of, we want something that's never been done before. That's kind of all they were like. It's got to get 1 million views on YouTube. And this is not, it's not a very inspiring conversation. You want to talk about going a bit more in depth. Now, where it can become promising is if your motivations are aligned. And in the case of the Saatchi and Saatchi project, that was where it was 100% aligned. The creative directors, we weren't trying to promote Saatchi and Saatchi, we were trying to create this performance that did everything we wanted to do. So I think where there could be hope in the future is if this culture becomes more ingrained in commercial entities, where ad agencies, and I should also say I know a lot of amazing people in ad agencies. The problem isn't the people, the problem is the process. There's so many people, it's such a big wheel that it's only as strong as the weakest link. So you could have 10 people who are amazing, but then someone somewhere breaks that link. So as this culture gets more ingrained in those kind of environments, where more people it becomes more satellites and localized small teams who have power and budget to realize things, like what happened in Saatchi and Saatchi. The guys we were dealing with, they had the power to sign off anything within the budget. So we could make decisions and we could move forward. They didn't have to go back, get sign-off, go back and get sign-off. So if that model starts to become more the norm, then I think we can do more interesting collaborations.
And Tatiana, a question that is also a bit of a provocation. When you talk in the context of the tech industry about disruption and innovative disruption and the effect of disruption, beyond the initial positive reading of it, behind it is always winners and losers. You know, for every disruption that sort of reshapes a market, there is people who win and people who get sided on the tracks. So who could be or who are the winners and losers if you take the notion of disruption within the context of the arts and culture?
Yeah, I don't know. Also, I think if you speak about winner or losers, depends always what is your perspective. So if you have a certain perspective, you could think somebody is a winner, instead is a loser, and vice versa. So I don't know. In that sense, we are also creating, again, a dialectic that is exactly the kind of way of thinking that I'm trying to criticize, because my point of view is that, as I say, we are speaking more about a layering instead of an oppositional perspective. So by assuming that there have always been developments and interlink between art, business, technology developments since forever, then I think also doesn't make sense to speak about winner and loser, because from one point you could say some people have won, others have lost, and vice versa. So I would say I prefer to shift the point of this conversation, and by assuming that exists this disruptive feedback loop among art, business, and disruption, then what is the role of the artist today? That I don't think, okay, some artists could decide they want to make business, and of course I'm not criticizing. This is absolutely not an ideological perspective. Of course I have my ideologies, but it's not what I want to bring into this specific perspective about the loop. The idea is, I think that if you want to be an artist and you want to be critical, I think that then you have first of all to understand that perhaps you should try to create new tactics that are not necessarily being oppositive, because we know that since many years this opposition actually never existed. But still I think it's important to be critical, otherwise you just enter into this chain of appropriation that is part of the new liberal economy. So for me it's more like a big question mark. It's not that I have a solution, but with all my research I'm trying actually to demonstrate that are necessary new kind of strategies that are not only accepting the status quo, so say, okay, we are doing business, because I think that is a bit too easy, but if you really want to do a critique, I think it's also too easy just to say, okay, I'm going to oppose everything, because it doesn't work anymore, and you are basically legitimating who you are going to oppose. So that is why I speak about disruption, because I think disruption goes inside this loop and try to show the contradiction that are part of this loop, and try to play with them, trying to shake them, and in this way to create new form of imaginations that could be what the artist can do.
I'm gonna open for questions. I don't know if we have a mic. Yeah, we have some people over there. Yeah.
Ashok Mystery, artist that's disaffected by digital at the moment. I suppose, if we, just picking up on your ideas about the liberal economy, if we see populations moving from citizens to consumers, where does disruption kind of fit within that new model of kind of where corporates have more grip? I mean, a lot of the platforms that we have now are corporate platforms. Mm-hmm. So where does that disruption actually exist now in a consumer society?
I think we have many examples of artists that have been worked with that. And for example, I could mention a work of the L'Alliance Invisible from 2009 that was called seppuku, and they were also questioning, for example, how in Facebook you are creating a chain of friendship that are based on your relationship and your identity is total commercialized. So basically they understood the mechanism behind that and we're really trying to study the codes beyond the interface of Facebook and created this really interesting project called Seppuku that was a virtual suicide that the people were invited to generate, and of course they were not interested in the suicide itself, but was more to try to create a public opinion and a discussion about how the identity of the people are actually becoming, a part of a business making. So I think that this is something the hackers have already thought since 30 years, so that if you want to criticize something, you have to understand how this machine works, so what are the rules of that, what are the code behind, even the term of condition that you are signing should be understood, and then playing with this materiality, I think, could come a new form of art, and actually have been already come. I mean, there have been a lot of artists working with that. And I think especially now, for example, in Berlin, there is a really big debate related to the Snowden disclosure and the NSA surveillance program, and I think in that sense also, many people are working with cryptography, understanding how you can protect your data, but I also think that perhaps we need new form of imagination related to that. So you don't need just to hide yourself, but maybe you can also be proactive and generate new imaginary. But I don't have the answer. This should be done by artists, I think.
Any other? Yeah, over here. Over there, yeah.
It's just a comment from Tatiana's presentation. It's about disruption from within, but while you're being enterprising. And the term there is not an entrepreneur, it's the intrapreneur in social organisation speak, INTRA-preneur. You're an enterprising person within an organisation, and you change the organisation or that part of it from within. Mm-hmm. And that, again, links to the arts. It can be an artist in residence within, is an intrapreneur. Mm-hmm. It's an enterprising person within the organisation.
Yeah, I didn't reflect about this discourse of entrepreneur. Maybe it's a new concept, but still, I think, I'm actually appropriating this concept from business because, as I say, the first using disruption was basically, in that specific business concept, was Christians. And the point is that since many business concepts have been appropriating, I would say, concept and discourse of the counterculture, we know that is a chain that always works, then I think perhaps artists could appropriate business language and start to work with disruption themselves. Then maybe, yeah, they could be, as you say, entrepreneur, but I say that I don't think that there is a strong division among artists and entrepreneurs, and especially going on the Silicon Valley, you understand that. So I don't think they are two words so separated. I think maybe the new challenge should be considering that, then what the artist can do. And in that sense, we should create new form of imaginary. But I don't think that they are really two different hemispheres. That is why today in the morning we're speaking about post-digital, and I think this post-digital definition is pretty relevant today because actually shows that the digital is everywhere and certain dichotomy don't exist anymore. So what is that? What the artist can do today to create a new form of criticism? I think that is the challenge.
So we are actually out of time. We just reached the moment for the next session. Thanks a lot, everybody, and thanks to my speakers, and thanks for coming.